This is lecture number DR011US05. This is the 11th of the Mega Genius lectures and the 5th lecture of the Uncommon Sense series. It was recorded on November 16th, 2000. The title of this lecture is A Course in Education. It is 33 minutes long. Copyright 2000 by Mega Genius. All rights reserved. This lecture is protected by internationally valid copyright. It may not, in whole or in part, be duplicated, transmitted, or otherwise reproduced without the express permission of Mega Genius. Unauthorized translation, importation, or distribution is a violation of applicable laws. Mega Genius is a United States federally registered trademark and service mark. And now, here is Mega Genius.
If you are tired of hearing solutions to why Johnny can't read, imagined by people who can't think, then hear this. Here are the Genius Formula's answers to problems of our educational system. The reason Johnny cannot read is that he has not been taught to read by those who supposedly were willing and able to produce the results and who were paid well to get the job done. Teaching a child to read is like teaching a dog to retrieve a ball. The trainer or teacher uses a ball or book to communicate in an understandable fashion what is required. The dog returns with the ball, and the student reads from the book. Education does not depend on elaborate buildings or endless funding. One-room schoolhouses of the 1800s, using simple McGuffey's readers, turned out a higher percentage of literate students than the multi-million-dollar edifices of today, with their psychologically correct texts and hair dryers in the boys' locker rooms. What it does require is educators who understand and practice the fundamentals of communication. When they don't, Spot fails to fetch the ball, and Johnny does not learn to read. There are 5 simple prerequisites to teaching any reasonably healthy child to read. 1. Appropriate instructional materials. 2. The space in which to accomplish the task. 3. The time to devote to the matter. 4. One who understands and is able to teach. 5. A conscious student. Actually, I'm being lenient, as the student need not be conscious. He can be revived. If the student is not interested in learning to read, the teacher remedies that promptly. In short, if the student does not learn to read, the teacher is not being a teacher. Beyond that, there are excuses. Don't slide into the ravine of thinking that just because some students learn, the trouble is with those who do not. Approximately 20% of students will essentially teach themselves, provided they are not prevented from learning by some external influence. Another 40% or so will respond favorably to any reasonable educational technology. The basic task is in identifying and remedying the elementary learning difficulties of the remainder, which is what educators who know their business can do. As one who has spent much of his life being formally educated and who has successfully taught many subjects to thousands of students, I know that too many of our current educational techniques are exasperatingly mediocre, and consequently so are the results. Here is a mega-truth. Ability is intelligently measured by results produced. We know the job is not getting done when our public educational system spends 12 years producing illiterates, high school graduates who cannot read and understand a magazine article or a newspaper, who cannot complete an application for employment, who cannot calculate the proper change from a dollar. We know our children's future has been jeopardized when an entire classroom of high school seniors is stumped by the question, who was Franklin Pierce? Disaster is descending when 8th grade students cannot find France on a world map or locate the continent of Australia or identify the Atlantic Ocean. Yesterday's poorly educated children are becoming today's ignorant adult society. For instance, a recent survey revealed that 63% of U.S. adults now are unable to find Germany on a world map. During the last 3 decades, the average Scholastic Achievement Test, SAT, score has plunged some 80 points. What's really wrong with our educational system? Plenty. One of the errors made nowadays is the inaccurate assignment of importance to subjects. It's more meaningful to teach a child to read, write, and perform basic arithmetic calculations by hand than to score with a basketball, practice scales on a saxophone, or examine and diagram the stomach contents and associated viscera of a pickled Peruvian toad. I recall being required to draw a precise representation of a fibrovascular bundle in a plant stem. I remember having to memorize a dozen examples of copulative verbs, used to link subjects with predicate complements. I'll never forget the demonstration of how to calculate manually and rapidly the cube root of any number. All right, but why was I never taught how to evaluate the provisions of an insurance policy, or balance a checkbook with a bank's monthly statement, or present myself most effectively to a potential employer? Aren't these abilities more useful to most students? Let's teach first things first. If after 12 years of schooling a graduate cannot read and understand instructions on a bottle of medicine, write an intelligible letter to another human, and convert a recipe that serves 4 to serve 5, he will surely have difficulty convincing others that he has been educated at all. Institutions of higher learning have something to learn themselves. They have never learned the difference between relaying information and increasing knowledge. For example, you could register for a full load of courses, attend every class, leave each day with a train of 20 mules to help you lug away all the information, and pass all the courses magna cum cerebrum. And then 5 years later you might discover that none of the information they taught you was of any great value or something you could really use in life. It reminds me of my college days. Conversely, a few years later, you could stumble onto a pearl or two of wisdom where you least expected it, solve half of your life's problems, and pitch your old diploma in the nearest wastebasket. In fact, I literally saw a woman do that in Salt Lake City, Utah, a few years ago. Her diploma reflected a master's degree she had earned in psychology, but years later she read a book and suddenly considered that she had finally tasted knowledge by learning something worth knowing. Learning the difference between relaying information and increasing knowledge is directly related to a megatruth, which is, intelligence is the ability to differentiate. Consequently, I am sorry to say that in Intelligence 101, most educational institutions have earned a grade of incomplete. Another error common to education is the disregard for or mismeasurement of the learning rates of students. The school system I attended as a young child entirely overlooked that my intelligence was too high to be accurately measured. Don't you think someone, at least our acclaimed school psychologist, might have noticed? Consequently, my early fascination with such subjects as philosophy and astronomy were continually redirected towards such activities as playing musical chairs and pasting animal cutouts onto sheets of colored paper. Talk about torture. I will never forget secretly attempting to recall some 40 orders of insects: Hymenoptera, Coleoptera, Lepidoptera, Homoptera, Odonata, Raphidiodea, Chorodentia, Plasmatodia, etc., while being forced to finger paint. I have never forgiven them for that. When I tried to explain to my first grade teacher that I needed a more challenging curriculum, I quickly found myself standing in a hall corner with my mouth taped shut. Well, I wasn't learning much anyhow. Actually, I did learn to finger paint, an ability that I have not used since, but obviously the authorities failed utterly to teach me to keep my opinions to myself. Few children are true geniuses. The learning rates of most people vary from class to class and day to day, depending on such factors as the instructor's techniques and personalities, the cumulative effect upon the student of misunderstandings about subjects, distractions in the classrooms, physical discomforts, lack of sleep, and absenteeism. Yet our standard approach is to mechanically disseminate course material to dozens of students in each classroom with little regard for these variables. As a result, many students spend their time scrambling to keep pace with the instructor, while others sigh with impatience. Of course, you also have the extremes, those utterly lost souls who sense a rapid darkening of the room, and those mental marvels who memorize logarithms while calculating angles of impact of cells floating in their eyeballs. A far more effective teaching method is to present the study material to the students individually, allowing each to absorb at his or her own pace with the option of reviewing any portion as needed. Whenever a student can demonstrate his understanding of a section of the material, he should immediately be permitted to move to the next chapter, taped lecture, or experiment, without either being rushed into it or held up due to the learning rates of others. The more a student is allowed to progress at his own pace, the more efficient and effective the learning process becomes in the long run. This teaching method requires that study materials be completely standardized, but that's long overdue. With today's electronic technology, there is no reason the material presented to Mary in the morning should differ from what's presented to John in the afternoon when he has progressed to the same point in the course. A teacher's job should be to ensure that every student understands the standardized material and can use it, no more and not one iota less. Too often, students are only required to learn a portion of the necessary material, another fundamental error in our educational system. Imagine that you enrolled in a course in first aid that addressed 100 points considered essential to saving the lives of accident victims. Now, if you understood and could apply them all by the end of the course, you might expect to receive a grade of A. But what if you failed to learn that leaving a tourniquet in place for 30 minutes will probably result in amputation? And what if you did not remember that a person with a deep wound about the head or torso should not be given food or water, as he will probably require surgery? And what if you forgot that people have suddenly begun to breathe on their own after having received more than 4 hours of continuous cardiopulmonary resuscitation? Should you still receive an A because you answered 97 questions correctly on the final exam? If you missed 12 more questions, should you receive a B for good? Would a C- mean that you knew approximately as much as the other students who failed about 20% of the course material, except that you really didn't know quite as much as they did, but you passed anyhow? Doesn't something strange seem to be going on here? Just what are these B's, C's, and D's? Are we failing our children by not requiring that they learn all the essentials? Or are we wasting time attempting to teach extraneous material? Could it be both? In fact, the only material we should teach is that which is worth learning. A student either learns it all thoroughly or he doesn't. If he does and can demonstrate his understanding, he should promptly be passed. If he does not, he should be guided through a review of the material until he does. Compromising on essential results is the surest road to mediocrity, or worse. Another error is that students are seldom permitted to openly question the accuracy of the information they are taught, even though many of today's facts are certain to be recognized tomorrow as historical misobservations. Students learn much more thoroughly by questioning, examining, and concluding for themselves than by being forced to swallow and digest information just because it's expounded in a classroom. Much of what was recently taught in our modern educational system about the origin of man, the composition of other planets, the safety of common chemicals, the intelligent management of natural resources, the merits of atomic testing, and the proper disposal of nuclear waste, to cite just a few examples, is now considered wrong. Even the sacrosanct diet that was jackhammered into the mind of every school child just a few years ago is now viewed as dangerously unhealthy. What happened? How did many of yesterday's authoritative facts suddenly metamorphose into erroneous conclusions? Is there anything wrong with questioning what we are taught? Isn't it the intelligent approach? To make matters worse, students are often graded inaccurately due to the inability of instructors to evaluate unemotionally. For instance, I was required daily to submit an essay for a collegiate English composition class. One morning, my eminent instructor displayed a painting of a clown that was the subject of the student's next assignment. Well, having collected some of the world's most famous art, I know good technique when I see it. I didn't see it that day. So, in forthright terms, that's what I wrote. When my essay was returned, however, I saw something I did recognize instantly, a bold red F. It was the first I had ever received in any class. With percolating curiosity, I checked my grammar, and diction, and punctuation. I checked my logic. What was wrong with my essay? There was no indication. None, that is, until I discovered that the artist was the instructor. Here's another example. In high school, I bet a physics student that I could win first place in that category in a county science fair, even though I had been so busy with chemistry and Latin too, that I had neither taken a physics class nor even opened a textbook on that subject. My plan was to design and construct a simple Van de Graaff electrostatic generator, which worked on the principle by which you might shuffle your shoes across a carpet and produce a small spark upon touching another person. As only a short time remained before the project had to be completed, I decided to influence the judges' opinions by substituting theatrics for my ignorance of physics. My generator would have to produce a larger spark. Bertha, as I called my creation, towered nearly 7 feet high and generated 4-foot arcs of crackling white lightning at 1-second intervals of more than 1 million volts each, almost 4 billion volts an hour. She really wasn't dangerous since her amperage was minimal, but the visual and sonic effects were, well, electrifying. Even my brother, who was seldom impressed by anything, developed respect for Bertha. It probably had something to do with the first time I activated her in his presence and the 4-foot electrical bolt that unexpectedly discharged from an empty light socket on the basement ceiling, striking the side of his head and knocking him to the floor. At any rate, I thought he acted peculiarly cautious around Bertha after that. I learned 2 things of importance from my experiments with Bertha. Above her motor housing rose a tall cylinder where the static electricity was generated that supported a 3-foot diameter steel collecting sphere. That was where the high-volt charge accumulated. My first discovery was that I could cause small objects fashioned from aluminum foil to stabilize in an orbit around the sphere. The explanation of that intriguing phenomenon was the basis of my science fair project. My second discovery occurred a few seconds after I held a circular fluorescent lamp near the collecting sphere to see if it would light up in my hand from the electricity in the air, even though it was disconnected from any normal electrical circuit. It did, and then all hell broke loose. The lamp acted as a capacitor, accumulating the generator's electrical charge until the flow suddenly reversed with a bone-jarring, gut-wrenching, ultra-voltage discharge that streaked through my arm, chest, stomach, and leg with a stunning crack, followed by a final sensation as if my toe was smashed by a hammer. It was one of those shocking aspects of life, on the order of a falling meteorite, an array of St. Elmo's fire, or an attack of ball lightning, that might horrify an adult, but greatly amuse a teenager. I confess to having re-experienced the effect once a day for the next couple of weeks, but always with the intention of re-evaluating the sensation to see if it was as awesome as I remembered. It always was. Well, as the physics teacher and 2 other judges approached my exhibit on the day of the science fair, Bertha was working up an awful storm. They all eyed my contraption, nodded to me, and the physics teacher extended his hand in the direction of the collecting sphere. Bertha responded instantly by slapping him with a yard-long crackling white electrical arc. He jerked back involuntarily and smiled quickly. "Oh," he teased me, "that's not much worse than an electric fence, is it?" Well, I didn't know what an electric fence felt like, but I knew of something that I was sure would impress him more. "Here," I replied with a smirk, thrusting the fluorescent lamp into his hand, "hold this." After a few seconds the lamp flickered and then glowed in his fingers as the charge amassed. Then, in an instant, the interior of the lamp exploded with a let-there-be-light brilliance, a concussion as loud as a shotgun blast, and a jolt sufficient to stun a buffalo. He grimaced, clutched his jaws involuntarily, and bellowed like a lost calf. Then there was only silence, except for the erratic sparking of his electrostatically charged hair, extending in all directions. "How was that?" I inquired devilishly, as the color drained from his spastic face and I pried his fingers from the lamp. But he never answered. He just stared at Bertha until the other judges led him away without my ever having had the opportunity to explain what my project was all about. Nevertheless, I did win first place in physics at the science fair with a top rating of superior. Now, in the case of the clown painting, my failing grade on the essay had no relation to the quality of my composition. And in the case of the electrostatic generator, my superior grade at the science fair had no relation to the quality of my unexplained and unappraised project. In both instances, I received grades that had no basis in fact, because momentary emotions overshadowed rational evaluations. Now, still another error of education today is the lack of differentiation between memory and understanding. Among my favorite tests in high school was the kind designed to measure my reading speed and comprehension, because I knew what was really being addressed was merely my abilities to speed read and remember. Consequently, although I always scored in the highest percentile in the nation, the truth was that I often had only a vague concept of the test material. But no one ever noticed. As long as I could skim and recall, I did not have to understand. For example, consider this sentence. Dweet, king, and temple are types of tangors, but an Elenvar is not. Okay, now let's test our memory. How many types of tangors are there? Well, at least 3. All right, how does an Elenvar differ from a Dweet? Well, it's not a type of tangor. That's fine. What is the relationship between a king and a temple? Well, they are types of tangors. Very good. Now, let's test our understanding of what we read. What is a Tangor? Whoops. What is an Elenvar? Flunk. What is the difference between a Tangor and an Elenvar? Flunk out. Actually, a Tangor is a citrus fruit, a tangerine-orange hybrid, and an Elenvar is a type of hairspring made of a special alloy that allows the balance wheel in a pocket watch to oscillate. But what is particularly worth learning is that memory is no substitute for understanding. Another primary error in our educational system is a broadly unaddressed factor that has undermined and destroyed the effectiveness of education in America for decades. Let's pretend that Johnny graduated from an unconventional educational system. His instructors emphasized reading, writing, and arithmetic. They allowed him the flexibility to progress at his own speed so that he was neither frequently bored nor overwhelmed. They ensured that he learned 100% of the course material. They stressed the teaching of facts, not opinions, and allowed him to question their assertions to his satisfaction. They were not excessively concerned with what he did and did not remember, as long as he could demonstrate a thorough understanding of each section of the material. Now, what could still be wrong with his education? Well, a potential employer might complain that Johnny does not have any experience, but his primary concern would really be that Johnny was never taught how to use what he had learned. That is a major blunder of our educational system. Despite his diploma, Johnny may not yet have learned anything useful because he cannot use it. He is a politician who cannot get elected. He is a psychiatrist who cannot cure depression. He is a teacher who cannot teach. Whatever he is, his educators failed to teach him how to use what he had supposedly learned to produce the desired results. Believe me, it happens in your town or city every day. As the director of corporate communications and public affairs for a nationwide marketing firm, I once interviewed more than 400 job applicants, all of whom had already been screened by others. All were recent college graduates from schools throughout the United States. All had majored in the subject of communications. Almost 93% were so lacking in basic English skills they could not write a reasonably professional paragraph, something they should have learned at least in junior high school. Their punctuation, I couldn't find it, was atrocious. Their spelling, I couldn't bear it, was ludicrous, and they must have thought that a dictionary was an artifact used by an interior decorator to fill a hole in a bookshelf, if they ever thought about one at all. Equally remarkable, though, they had all been taught that they could write, and they believed it. I immediately began to suspect that the reason these communications majors, whose verbal skills were also disappointing, had such trouble communicating might have to do with their not understanding what the word meant. So I asked each applicant this question. In your own words, can you define communication? Well, you could see the wheels of their minds spin like demons, gnash with a crunch and char. They had realizations. The usual response was a withering pause followed by, "No, I guess I can't." A single applicant replied, "I think it's the act of sending something from one place to another." Not too bad. He could write, too. But all the remainder found themselves faced with the tragic fact that they had never been taught what the subject was in which they had majored. Yet every one of them had graduated, proudly, with a diploma from a modern authoritative institution of higher learning. The real reason Johnny cannot read is the same reason he cannot write or perform basic arithmetic calculations. In spite of instructions, textbooks, assignments, study periods, homework, and all, he has not been taught to understand and use. Accordingly, anyone who cannot use what he has been taught has learned nothing useful. The responsibility for why Johnny cannot read falls far and wide. It rests with Johnny, who has a responsibility to educate himself when others fail. It rests with his teachers, who have a responsibility to produce the required results. It rests with school administrators, who have a responsibility to design effective programs and to ensure that teachers are able and permitted to do their jobs. It rests with parents, who have a responsibility to teach their children and to inspire them to learn. And it rests with society at large, which has a responsibility to elect government officials with sufficient intelligence to lead countries to greater heights rather than steer them into ravines of ineffectiveness, confusion, and turmoil. Is this a major factor? It certainly is. I'll explain. When I was being educated by the United States public school system, the #1 student problem reported by teachers was talking. Today, according to the press, it is said to be drugs. #2 was chewing gum. Today it is reportedly alcohol. #3 was making noises. Today it is pregnancy. #4 was running in the halls. Today it is suicide. #5 was cutting in line. Today it is rape. #6 was improper dress. Today it is robbery. Need I go on? Followed in order by assault, burglary, arson, bombing, and murder. Today, schools distribute condoms, and children carry guns, join gangs, and gangbang. Drive-by shootings are epidemic. Popular music is often angry and obscene. Motion pictures are wrought with injury and death. Although they inspire some teenagers to violence, they reflect the entertainment that is real to young people, and that they therefore want to see and hear. So, what is the matter with kids today, and what does all this have to do with politicians and the management of our country? Well, plenty. The young person looks at those in charge and sees only that they have irresponsibly dropped the whole planet on his foot. Teenagers have always acted up and rebelled against authority, but something changed. In the 1920s, it was flappers, spit curls, and the Charleston dance. That had evolved by the 1950s into T-shirts, duck butt haircuts, and rock and roll. Hardly a matter of great social concern. But then came the 1960s, with bell-bottom trousers, boys with shoulder-length hair, and acid rock, and LSD, runaways, draft dodgers, protests, political violence, the occupation of universities, bombings. What was going on? What was happening was that due to bad governmental management, young men were being forced by the tens of thousands to die in Vietnam for a cause they did not support, in an undeclared war the government did not conduct to win. You see, there is an important difference between giving your life for a reason that you believe in and being forced to die for one that you do not. It is a matter of whether you or someone else controls your life. In essence, the mishandling of the Vietnam War severely threatened, and in many cases destroyed through death, the future for many teenagers of that era. Accordingly, they rebelled, became deeply angry, joined forces, lived for the moment, and expressed their outrage and even violence against those who supported the threat, the establishment, and the apparent source of the threat, President Lyndon Baines Johnson. In addition, the combined effects of assassination, such as those of President John F. Kennedy, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, and the Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr., darkened their future further. The division between the older generation, which initially strongly supported the war, and the younger and most directly threatened generation, which energetically opposed it, substantially tore the country in two and significantly resulted in an extensive breakdown of the family unit. Not since the American Civil War of the 1860s had an issue so deeply dissolved the cohesiveness of the American people. The primary factor that continues to inhibit the healing process is the same masked culprit that is directly accountable for the original division: bad governmental management. Look at where it has led us. Just a few decades ago, the average teenager could look forward to obtaining a decent job, buying a home, and raising a family. Today, he can look forward to a depressed job market, extensive unemployment, unaffordable home ownership, polluted oceans, a hazardous atmosphere, soaring drug abuse, suppressive taxes, a welfare state, an extensive homeless population, increased mental illness, a crippled economy, prohibitive medical costs, swiftly rising criminality, the rapid depletion of natural resources, the extinction of many species, buried time bombs of nuclear waste, and a staggering national debt that his generation must resolve. That is his inheritance of bad judgment. News item: suicide by teenagers is skyrocketing. The teen suicide rate in the United States during the last 3 decades has more than tripled. Well now, what in the world did their little minds have to worry about? When an individual, group, or civilization feels that its survival is threatened and no solution is apparent, the reaction is predictable. Initial anger is soon replaced by fear and subsequent surrender. The youth of today is so constantly overwhelmed by its perception of the future that the group displays all 3 characteristics simultaneously, with some members expressing continual anger, others deep-seated fear, and others a surrender of concern entirely. You see it in the violence they embrace, the hostility they expound, and the obscenities they use. You see it in the disharmony of the art they exhibit. You see it in the anger of the music they communicate. Most of today's teenagers have lost the incentive to establish goals. They don't think a survivable tomorrow is going to exist. For example, throughout the 20th century alone, hundreds of thousands of Americans have willingly died for their country. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. said, quote, "Unless a man has discovered something that he is willing to die for, he is not fit to live," unquote. Yet a recent survey of American youth showed that few can even conceive of something for which they would be willing to die. Many teenagers today neither care if they live or die, nor care about tomorrow. They don't think they will live to see it. They have been robbed of their ability to care. That is one reason society carries so many weapons, commits so much violence, and has become so criminally oriented. The gang member sells your child drugs, robs your friend blind, and murders you, all without a reason, because he doesn't care. He has no worthwhile goals to attain. The future doesn't appear survivable. The future... What future? Is their reaction to an apparently unsurvivable future intelligent? Far from it. Is it understandable? I think so. Imagine that astronomers discovered that a gigantic meteor was on a direct and unavoidable collision course with Earth. All humanity would unquestionably be extinguished. Calculated time to impact was 42 days and counting. Now, do you think the world would change during those 6 weeks? Would it change for the better? Well, if there were an apparent solution, it probably would in many respects. Wars would end, groups would unite, and major problems would suddenly be viewed as so insignificant that they would be resolved by mass agreement and in short order. But since in this scenario the extinction of mankind is imminent, it would certainly change for the worse. People would exhibit extreme anger. A live-for-the-moment attitude would prevail. The use of force would be the order of the day. Soon thereafter, much of civilization would slide into worldwide fear, and finally a whimpering acceptance of the inevitable. The future... What future? You see, it isn't that man is an animal. He is not. He is much more than that. But I'll tell you something about his violent nature that is quite true. In fact, this will explain more about the thinking and behavior of man than the top 10 textbooks on psychology ever written, and it is a megatruth. Man thinks and acts like an animal to the degree that he considers that his survival is threatened. Give some thought to what the genius formula reveals. It is advice you have sought for a long time. Why doesn't Johnny want to learn? Because he thinks he doesn't have a future. Teach Johnny by word and deed that he does have a future, that it belongs to him and is survivable, and that he can prosper in it, all of which the genius formula indicates is true. If you communicate that idea effectively and provide a workable and safe environment in which Johnny can learn, he will cease to be part of the problem, will become part of the solution, and will discover something he lost long ago, the desire to learn. Then, by having redirected his intention, and thereafter inspiring him to learn, Johnny's opposition to the teaching process will be replaced by cooperation with his teachers. A worthwhile goal? I think so, for here is a lesson well worth learning. In the absence of Johnny's desire to learn, there is no education.